Welcome, everyone. We're going to give people just a minute to join us. Thanks for being here. Welcome, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to first start by welcoming all of you and thanking you for being with us today. I'm Jennifer Mnookin, and I have the good luck of being dean here at UCLA School of Law. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for joining us. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UCLA sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonka peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. I want to welcome you to this latest installment in our From the Front Lines virtual series. In these uncommonly challenging times, I feel very lucky that here at UCLA Law School, we have faculty, alums, and friends who are among the foremost experts in the legal, social, and political issues at the heart of so many of the current conversations. For today's conversation, 52 years after Stonewall, a discussion of legal challenges facing LGBTQ people, including the Supreme Court Fulton ruling, we're tremendously thankful to have the UCLA Williams Institute as a co-sponsor. I would also like to specifically thank John McDonald and Rob Wright for their dedication to the Williams Institute by naming a faculty chair. And one of our panelists today is joining UCLA as a faculty member and as the McDonald Wright chair. And we're very excited about that. Now, the month of June commemorates the Stonewall riots and champions equal rights with month-long pride celebrations of identity and time to really focus on acknowledging the accomplishments of LGBTQ individuals, something that we should do all year, but Pride Month gives us an extra chance to do that. And I'm especially honored to welcome our panel of experts today to take a close look at both the victories in support of equal rights for the LGBTQ community, as well as the numerous challenges that remain. My role today is to introduce the panel and to get to ask questions as the moderator. And so that's what I'm going to do right now. My introductions will be very, very quick so that we can have more time to hear from them. First, please welcome the very first LGBTQ judge appointed in the United States and a proud double Bruin, the Honorable Steve Lachs, class of 1963. Welcome, Steve.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here.
Great to have you. Next, please welcome a very soon-to-be colleague here at UCLA Law School, the incoming McDonald and Wright Faculty Chair at the Williams Institute, Cary Franklin, who officially begins here at UCLA on July 1st. It's terrific to have you. Welcome, Cary. You're muted.
Got to unmute.
I've only been doing it 18 months. Give me a break.
I know.
I'm so thrilled. I'm so excited. I can't wait to join you.
We're delighted to have you. And it wouldn't be a Zoom webinar without having to tell somebody at least once or twice that they're muted. It's part of the experience. And then last, but certainly not least, I'm pleased to welcome another proud Bruin, Kara Desert. I'm afraid I got that wrong after asking. Chief Executive Officer at the San Diego LGBT Community Center and a proud member of the class of 2012. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kara.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
So welcome, everybody. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'd also like to ask audience members to feel free to send in questions through the Q&A function on the webinar, and I will certainly make sure that we get to some of those questions that are on your minds as well. Steve, I'd love to start with you. I'm really honored to have you both as a panelist and as an alum. And by all accounts, you're the first LGBTQ judge, the first out LGBTQ judge, I should say, in the U.S. And possibly the world. So first, is that right? And second, can you tell us a little bit about your pathway to the bench?
Sure. Yes, that is correct. I have no idea whether there was an out judge in Zanzibar at some time, but I got letters from all over the world when I was appointed. And some people sent me newspaper clippings. I still have a clipping from a newspaper from Athens, for example, where they had a story. I'm told, because I can't read Greek, but I'm told it's a story about my appointment. And so the probability is that it was the first, I was the first openly gay judge in the world, but certainly in the country. My pathway to the bench it's a long story. You'd have to understand what it was like to be in this community in the 1970s, in the 1960s, and the 1970s to really understand it all. It was a completely different world for this group of people, gay and lesbians, etc. And it's hard to understand until you feel what was going on at that point. But basically, my path was, I graduated from, well, you know, the law school. UCLA Law School. It was a different school then, by the way, in 1963. I graduated from law school. I worked for some small firms. LA was basically small firms at that time. And eventually, through a whole story, I ended up in the public defender's office in LA County. And I was sitting in court one day, waiting for my case to be called, looked at the judge and sitting there thinking, you know, I could do that. And so they needed a Superior Court commissioner. They were going to elect 3 new Superior Court commissioners. I applied. There were, I don't know, a couple of hundred applications. I was fortunate. I was selected to be one of the 3, and I became a Superior Court commissioner in 1975. At the same time, I was very, very active in what was then the lesbian and gay community. I was on the board of directors of the center. I was on the board of directors of APLA in the 80s. I founded MECLA, which was the first big PAC, gay and lesbian PAC, a whole bunch of things. So, to make it short, by 1979, there were members of our community who had done a great deal to support Jerry Brown. He ran for president twice in his first time as governor. And there was a lot of support from this community for him when he ran for president. And they went to him. I knew him just, you know, from meeting him at a couple of meetings, but they went to him and they said they would really like somebody from our community as a judge. And it ended up, I was already, for 4 years plus, I was a judicial officer. A Superior Court commissioner is a judicial officer. And so I had the experience. I was totally involved in the community. And so I think I was sort of a natural for him to pick. And there I was.
Right. That's interesting. But so I mean, Brown was intentionally and purposefully looking to appoint the first judge from the gay and lesbian community.
Yes.
When you got appointed, right? So
definitely was. He came to a number of events and things like that. And I know two things. One, it was political because he was getting a lot of support from this community. The other thing I truly believe is it's something that he felt was the right thing to do. I really believe that. Not all politicians do things because they believe it's the right thing.
Right.
But I think in this case, he
It's
believes
nice when those come together, at least sometimes.
it really
right?
is. And so things just followed from there. Somebody was talking to me the other day. A year later, Rose Bird was the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court. She appointed me to sit on the Supreme Court just while there were a few vacancies, and she was able to fill them pro tem. And so I was the first openly gay person to sit on a Supreme Court, that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's been a wonderful career.
Right. Well, that's wonderful, and it also means that you were a pioneer, right? I mean, you're a first, and that has a certain kind of it brings a certain kind of attention and opportunity, but it also creates opportunities for others. And I'd love to stick with you for a next question before I kind of broaden this to our panel as a whole, to get your perspective on what's changed and what's remained the same in terms of professional opportunities for LGBTQ people. And
it's interesting when you say opportunities for others. When I was appointed, this made headlines all over the country. The headline in the LA Times was Brown appoints avowed homosexual as judge. But the headlines were all over, and I got mail from hundreds and hundreds of people. I still have some of it. And they would write to me, Judge Stephen Lachs, LA Superior Court, Los Angeles, California, and I'd get it. I'd get all of this mail. There was so many letters, people I never heard from before or after, and they said, thank you so much, because I never thought I could make anything of my life because I'm a lesbian, because I'm gay, whatever. Trans was not even part of the picture really at that time. And it was so many of these, so many people were happy to see you could do something with your life, even if you were a lesbian, even if you were a gay man. And so for me, that was really, really a wonderful, wonderful message to get, that I was able to do this for other people. I didn't do it really, I didn't do it, but it was a great thing.
Well, you did do it. I mean, you did it both as an individual and as a symbol, right? I mean,
yes,
you were both, and
okay.
you were acknowledging and recognizing that, but you were both. That's important.
What is left? I mean, it's mind-boggling. Where people who are 20 years old, 25 years old, I don't think they have any idea what it was like to be gay when I was their age. It's so different. Now we are talking about wedding cakes. In those days, you were being arrested. You were being fired from your job. You were being thrown out of your apartment. I did legal counseling for the new gay and lesbian, well, it was the Gay Community Services Center then. And all of these people I'd see every week had all of these problems. And finally, we've gotten to resolve a lot of them. Finally, we are married. My husband and I have been together 41 years. The first 20 years, we weren't able to do anything legal. But we're getting there, and inch by inch. I was thinking about this morning. I'm also Jewish. Mm-hmm. And in the 50s, the biggest name in entertainment was Arthur Godfrey. And Arthur Godfrey would go to Bal Harbor, Florida, to this wonderful, wonderful hotel. He'd stay at the hotel and broadcast from the hotel. And the hotel was restricted. Jews were not allowed. And there was a study done by the Anti-Defamation League in the 60s. 22% of the hotels in this country were restricted. Jews were not allowed. Well, in the 80s, my husband and I would try and make reservations at a hotel. And as soon as they heard two male names, they would say, oh, you can't have a double bed. We have to give you twin beds. And so it was little things like that. That's changed. It's remarkable what has happened in our country. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. We should celebrate it. There's a lot more. The biggest, and I'll end with this, I still think the biggest thing for our community is the personal thing. It's coming out to mom and dad, coming out to your friends at work, that kind of thing. That's still a really tough burden for a lot of folks. And to the extent that we can help folks with that, it would be a blessing.
Thank you. No, thank you for those reflections and for reminding us of how different the landscape is, and that even though certainly significant challenges remain, both at the personal level, as you just described, but also at the institutional and legal level, which we'll talk about. We are in a very different landscape in this country than we were when you were much younger. And that's an incredible thing to see and remember and recognize. And I also will say that in the last 20 years, I'm very proud of the way the Williams Institute has played a very meaningful role in helping to produce the data and information that's helped to expand civil rights and legal rights for the LGBTQ community. We're going to come back to you, Steve, but let me turn to Cary now. And we've heard a little bit about your story, Steve, and a number of positive changes over your professional lifetime. Cary, a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that a Catholic social services agency in Philadelphia could refuse to work with same-sex couples who are applying to be foster parents. This is the Fulton case, for those who may be familiar with it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case, about its importance, what the ruling does and doesn't do, and maybe something about the implications for gay rights?
Sure. And I want to say thank you to Steve for a number of reasons, but one which is injecting some optimism. I've been talking about Bostock for the past year, and it's been a happy and relative optimistic time. I'm not going to do that today. So I'm glad we started out framing of recognizing how much work's been done and how far we come and how much sacrifice and how much been won. Because I'm now going to talk to you about the threats to all that. Sorry, but it's important. Right. I think it's a time where people need to collectively be aware that there's some jeopardy out there. I think pretty seriously. So the Fulton case, as Jennifer mentioned, this is a case in Philadelphia where Philadelphia says we're going to have a non-discrimination policy, can't discriminate against people on the basis.
Can I ask you to pause for 1 second? We're getting a little bit of feedback. I just confirmed it wasn't just me. Can you try muting and unmuting and seeing whether that works better?
How does that sound?
That sounds much better.
Is that better?
Oops,
Okay.
Still echoing.
Let me take out the phone and see how that goes.
Okay.
How is that any better?
Yes.
Yes.
A lot better. Okay. Sorry to interrupt, but I want us all to be able to hear what you're saying. So now back to it. You could have given us the optimistic story, but that's not what we're going to get today. So it's a good thing Steve got that. Now we get to hear about some current challenges. So.
Okay. So Fulton, the city of Philadelphia says we're going to have a non-discrimination policy. One of the things it covers is sexual orientation. If you want to contract with the city to do the work of certifying people to act as foster parents, you have to agree to abide by this policy. Right? Catholic Social Services says we're not going to abide by the policy. We don't believe in same-sex marriage. And the city says, okay, we will contract with other people who can abide by our policy. the Catholic Social Services Organization turns around and says, that's religious discrimination that violates our First Amendment rights. We're being penalized because we have particular religious beliefs. Okay, I want to say for the last 30 years, I think any scholar would have looked at that and said, good luck. Good luck under the doctrine. And the doctrine we're talking about is the 1990 case called Employment Division v. Smith. And what Employment Division v. Smith said was, if you have a neutral, generally applicable law, then it is subject to rational basis review, right? And it's subject to strict scrutiny if you're targeting a religious person. But otherwise, if it's just neutral and generally applicable, and they're not trying to go after Catholics or whatever group, then rational basis, and it's basically going to stand. And I will just add, this is the standard basically in race and sex and LGBT. That's how it generally works, that neutral, generally applicable laws get rational basis review. So the reason this was potentially going to be a blockbuster case was it teed up the overruling of Smith. Catholic Social Services asked the court to overrule Smith and to say that even neutral, generally applicable laws are subject to strict scrutiny and are probably going to get struck down as applied to this religious group if they burden the religion. So if Catholic Services is burdened by this law, they can probably get an exemption from it, because that's going to be called religious discrimination now. That was the aim of Catholic Social Services, to get rid of Smith and to get this higher standard of review and to get almost blanket exemptions whenever they asked from laws of general applicability. So if you are a real optimist, glass half full person, you say Fulton was something of a victory for the LGBT movement. It didn't overrule Smith, right? The religious right who've been working for 2 decades now to overrule this case, they didn't get that. That was the big prize. I think, however, this isn't a great victory for the LGBT movement and LGBTQ movement, and I'll tell you why. What the court did was basically hollow out Smith and say Catholic Social Services wins, and the reason they win is there is an exemption in this law. Now, it actually applied to placement of children, and it said the commissioner at the commissioner's discretion may grant an exemption when placing a child for reasons of best interest of the child. And I think the commission was thinking, the drafters of this rule were thinking, there may be cases where we want to take race into account in placing a child. And so we're going to write that exemption in. Okay, so first of all, I will say there isn't any exemption in the part of the statute talking about certifying parents. And second of all, no exemption has ever been granted to the non-discrimination policy. However, the court announces this rule. There is an exemption in the statute, and if there is ever an exemption for whatever reason, then religious people also get it. It's called the most favored nation status. Religious people now have most favored nation status. Any exemption in a law means it's going to be subject to strict scrutiny if you don't give it to religious people. Okay, that is a solidification of what's been happening in the COVID cases for the last 6 months. The court has been using what's called the shadow docket. These cases kind of fall under the radar and people aren't very aware of them, but the court has been announcing in these COVID cases, if you have any exemptions from these rules, barring gatherings of more than, the California rule was more than 3 households, then religious people had to get it. Well, guess what? Grocery stores were open. So religious people brought a suit and said, the grocery stores have more than, so we should be able to have large in-person religious gatherings. And the court said, yes, any exemption in any law, religious people, it's discrimination if they don't get it. So I think the implications of this are absolutely enormous. First of all, I think Smith is functionally overruled. I'm not clear that there's really much distinction between if they had overruled it, other than there would have been much more headlines and people would have been more aware of what the court actually did. Because one, almost every law has some kind of exemption. And two, it's up to the court what they want to style an exemption. So I believe that this has very wide-ranging implications. I'll just name one. Title VII, the massive federal statute that bars discrimination in employment. It has numerous exemptions, right? It exempts small businesses. There's a BFOQ exemption where you're sometimes able to discriminate in a narrow set of cases. Anyway, there are plenty of exemptions in that statute. Does that mean religious people now have an exemption from following Title VII's bar on discrimination? That's a very plausible argument that they do under this current doctrine. So I think we're in the midst of a fairly massive, substantial, and important transformation of this doctrine. And we're going to see a lot more religious exemptions to laws of general applicability, the biggest prize being non-discrimination laws. And I also, in the final thing I just want to say is that this doctrine has changed for religious right. It hasn't changed for race. It hasn't changed for sex. It hasn't changed for LGBT rights. Neutral laws of general applicability, some of them can place crushing burdens on these communities I just named, and they're going to be still upheld by the court as long as they don't target groups with malice. So what this case does is create two tiers of rights, with religious rights being top tier rights and the other rights I just named being absolutely second tier rights.
Okay, well, so we did start with Steve and a sort of optimistic vision of how much has been accomplished, and then you've shared with us why this case that hasn't gotten so many headlines is perhaps much more concerning than people recognize. Can I ask a quick follow-up about this? I mean, there's a few different directions we could go, but one is, I mean, this was unanimous, right? Do you think that's surprising given what you've just described? So can you say a little bit more about that, or about how you think that might play out in the cases to follow, which are almost certainly going to happen?
Sure. I think what happened is that, well, I could tell a more complicated story about what I really think happened, but I shouldn't. Okay, here's a little bit of speculation inside baseball. I think Justice Alito had the majority and lost it. The majority in this case was a 16-page, relatively brief, clean cut. We're preserving Smith. This is just limited to its facts kind of a take. Justice Alito wrote a 77-page concurrence railing on Smith and railing on the treatment of religious people, particularly Christians in this country, and the need for their freedom and how much discrimination they have faced, especially by anti-discrimination laws protecting gay people. And it was quite a piece of work. It reads like a majority opinion. One guess, I'm not the only person to guess this, is that he went a little far and he lost a couple of people. And at that point, the three more liberal justices realized that they could try to fashion a least destructive majority opinion as possible to preserve Smith, and that they could get enough justices in the majority to do that with them, and that they went for it. And they preserved Smith. And I will say, they did preserve Smith. And so if I'm going to get really legal here for a second, if a law doesn't have an exemption, Smith still applies. So neutral, generally applicable laws are still subject to rational basis review. That is something. As I said before, I'm a little skeptical about how much work that's going to do, but Smith was something, and I think those justices wanted to preserve it. I also think the Chief Justice has repeatedly taken a strategy where he chips and chips and chips away and prefers to do that than doing the big, like think about Roe versus, there's a question about whether they're actually going to overrule Roe or they'll just chip and chip away at it. And for reasons of institutional concern, Chief Justice Roberts, I think, is concerned that the court not look political and be believed to be neutral. And it's easier to reinterpret cases than overrule these big precedents. That's a little bit of me editorializing about something that may have happened. But the bottom line answer to your question is, I think these justices were doing damage control.
Got it. Thank you. No, that's really helpful and interesting. And disconcerting for what comes next. But thank you for that nuanced discussion. Really, really helpful. I want to turn to Kara and ask you a couple of questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time to get the three of you talking to each other too. But Kara, I'd like to ask you. We're talking about sort of the shape of gay rights since the Stonewall riots over 50 years ago, and both some of the great progress that's been made as well as some of the ongoing challenges. And certainly in the minds of many, the affirmation of marriage equality by the Supreme Court was, just a huge, important leap for the LGBTQ community and the project of equal rights. At the same time, we certainly know, both through the work of the Williams Institute and through the kind of work that you're doing, that the community faces a great many on-the-ground challenges. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit, as the leader of one of the largest centers in the country. What issues are impacting the community that you see most directly? What are you and your colleagues most concerned about right now?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Pride. So the Stonewall Inn marked the beginning of our revolution to demand respect, fairness, equality, and dignity for LGBT people and our families. Started by Black and brown drag queens, who today would be known as transgender women and other LGBTQ people. You're right, this is our 52nd Pride Month. We have so much to celebrate. We have a vibrant, diverse, beautiful, visible, and resilient LGBTQ community. And in many ways, we have indeed come a long way from that day in Stonewall in 1969. But for LGBTQ people of color, for our transgender and non-binary community, for LGBTQ people battling our immigration system or living in poverty, those experiencing intersecting oppressions, it hasn't necessarily gotten better. We have 40% of homeless youth identifying as LGBTQ. LGBTQ youth, especially LGBTQ youth of color, face disproportionate discrimination and violence and are therefore overrepresented in our homeless population. 7 of 10 of these homeless youth who are LGBTQ say family rejection is the major reason for their homelessness. So once youth are on the streets, they are at higher risk for HIV, suicide, more likely to be victims of violence and sex trafficking. At particular risk within our LGBT youth population are LGBTQ youth of color. For these youth, the issue isn't just safe schools in terms of anti-bullying, but the school to prison pipeline. Not just family rejection, but also negative experiences within our child welfare system. Not just about being LGBTQ alone, but about the intersections of oppression for LGBTQ people of color, especially those experiencing poverty. So we know that young people need to be supported at home, at school, and in their communities. And some of the youth that we serve here at our San Diego Center have been rejected from all three. So that's youth. I want to talk next about health disparities. Over and over, I hear directly from transgender and non-binary people about their horrific experience with healthcare providers, where they go to the doctor and they're the ones informing their medical professionals about their bodies and what they need. A routine doctor visit or therapy visit can be met with ignorance and transphobia. It's not just uncomfortable, it's scary and anxiety provoking, and for some is unsafe. This can create an insurmountable barrier to creating a trusted relationship with a medical professional. This gap in competency, so much so that healthcare providers themselves report not feeling competent to serve the transgender community, is a huge issue. So let's look at some of the disparities for our trans population. 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide. Transgender women have the highest diagnoses of HIV, and 50% of transgender people have had to teach their healthcare providers about what it means to be transgender. This is why LGBT-focused community centers with a range of services are so important, and it's why Pride is so important. Our community, Pride is supposed to be a celebration of our bodies, our potential, our love, our families, our resilience, a celebration of how far we've come. But we have to focus also and commit to the work ahead to defeat some of these disparities. Let's talk about employment. there is an enormous gap between the formal legal protections that non-discrimination protections give us and actually being protected in your daily life. So talking about workplace discriminations, yes, it is illegal to refuse to hire someone on a number of protected classes, race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, but it is really hard to prove in real life. The hiring manager does not say, thanks for coming in, I'm not going to hire you because you're trans. They just say, thanks for coming in, and you never hear from them again. Amy Stevens, we've been talking about the Bostock case today. I want to lift up the life of Amy Stevens, the real person who was one of the 3 plaintiffs in this case. Amy, a pioneer, she'll live on in history forever, worked at a funeral home in Detroit, and in 2013 came out publicly as transgender to her employer. She was fired shortly after, and she never got to see the victory at the Supreme Court. It took 7 years to get to the Supreme Court, and in that time, Amy passed away, never able to achieve the victory that she has. And so there's a real gap between the laws that we fought so hard for, designed to protect us, and the real ability of folks who were already marginalized to navigate a complex legal system and to retain an attorney. The next steps are much harder to navigate our system when we have, transphobia and homophobia rooted into our institutions that include our legal institution. We've been talking about the Fulton case, and thank you so much, Cary, for those remarks. If you want to talk about the gap between formal equality and the real lives of LGBTQ people, the Fulton case is a good one to talk about. Let me tell you about a recent client at our center, a foster youth placed with a family who was rejected once that youth came out to the family as transgender. Imagine a youth who has already been rejected from numerous institutions and individuals in their life to end up in a 3rd foster care placement, to be removed from that home in the middle of the night because these adults refuse to let that youth be with them for even one more night. That sends a clear message. You're not part of our family. We don't want you in our home because you're transgender. Rejection like this causes so much harm, and yet no laws were broken and no policies were violated. Let's talk for a second about immigration. The Williams Institute has done incredible work here. There are over 300,000 undocumented LGBT people in this country, millions more who are US born, who are a part of immigrant families. We have seen, during the Trump administration, yes, there's a legal right to asylum, but if you do not have an attorney, and it's really critical to shine a light that there is no legal right to counsel in immigration law, like there is in criminal law, your chances of getting asylum are really slim if you don't have a lawyer, even if you are absolutely fleeing an unsafe place because you are LGBTQ. Transgender women are particularly vulnerable, navigating a system not designed for them, and are 97% more likely to be sexually assaulted in an immigration detention center. The last thing I want to lift up is really a focus on poverty. What's next? How do we get there? What does it mean to be absolutely equal in society for our LGBTQ community? We cannot get there without a deep examination of how we eradicate poverty in our community. There is a societal myth that gay people, lesbian people are white, wealthy, and it's just not true. LGBTQ people have a higher collective poverty rate when compared to cisgender straight people. 1/4 of LGB women live in poverty. Our transgender community is 4 times more likely to live in extreme poverty. That's $10,000 or less a year. The roots of poverty here are family rejection, unsafe schools that lead to higher dropout rates, leading to survival crimes, higher risk of incarceration, and of course, where I started, lack of competent healthcare. So we have made some incredible gains in formal equality and in societal acceptance. We've been a presidential candidate, we've been on the Olympic stage, and yet these disparities persist. And when an LGBT person tries to access care, often these are really insurmountable barriers. And because of that, the LGBTQ community is at higher risk for a number of health issues, including cancer, HIV, drug and alcohol abuse. and mental illness. And so I think we have so much more work to do until our full community, and that's everybody in our LGBTQ community, including LGBT people of color, we have a lot of work to do until our full community is safe, healthy, and thriving.
Thank you. Thank you for that invitation to recognize the ways in which there's so much work left to be done. I have both a narrow question and a broader question. The narrow question comes from an audience member, which is about, is there an organization that can develop a list of positive providers for transgender health, or some way of trying to recognize that there are some healthcare providers.
I think your sound may have gone out.
Went out.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so is there a way to kind of give, I'm on a wired connection and it's still telling me it's unstable, so forgive me. I'll make my question very quick. On healthcare specifically, are there ways of both encouraging the medical establishment to develop cultural competence and to create lists of healthcare providers who are culturally competent and interested in trying to support their trans patients in particular? The broader question is, given that legal opportunities don't necessarily translate into on-the-ground realities, what are the roles for somebody who wants to use their legal training to try to make a difference in the on-the-ground realities that you're coping with and trying to improve?
So I'd say yes to your first question. We need to radically reapproach how we provide healthcare to LGBTQ people. That means a deep examination of the curriculum in medical school, all the way through the experience of somebody who's a provider until they're seeing a patient face to face. So there's deep work to do there. And yes, LGBT centers across the country, there are over 200, always have lists of providers that they believe are LGBTQ competent, but those lists are historically difficult to maintain. LGBT organizations are chronically understaffed, and it takes quite a bit of work to ensure everyone on a list is still practicing, that new people who move to town get on the list. And then in terms of intersecting identities, sure, a provider may have been a great experience for a gay man who's wealthy in his 60s, and it may not be the best provider for a young transgender woman. And so what does it mean to be competent, and how do we examine that deeply, I think are really good questions. The second question about, what's next and how do we really take a bite out of this? Early in my career, I've been doing this work a long time. Early in my career, someone told me when I was running the No on 8 campaign for marriage equality, I was the regional field director in San Diego, and someone told me, the thing about our community is that we need our people everywhere. We need badass litigators who are taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. We need a bench that recognizes who we are in our humanity. And I'm looking at Judge Lachs as I say that. We need people who are taking the Amy Stevens, taking that case and deciding to stick with instances in which there is a gap to enforce the non-discrimination protections we have. We need people with legal training to also run LGBT centers and take a broader approach that includes social services. We need our people everywhere. We need LGBT people to write checks and to really express who they are as part of a community, reaching their hand back out to the person who needs help. We really need our people everywhere. We need our young, powerful LGBTQ people to tell their stories and to show their faces and their voices. And so we have so much work to do, but I think we really need our people everywhere, both those who are uniquely trained and who can be leaders in our legal community, but also folks who can be leaders all over. It's always that LGBT person who works in a bank who finds a way to get a $10,000 check to our center, right? And so I think, we really need everyone here for this fight. And I think Pride is a really good month to examine where we are and to ask, what am I doing personally to make sure that LGBTQ people in this country are thriving?
Thank you. This question is for all three of you, and I'd love to hear each of your take on this. We're marking 52 years since Stonewall. If we look ahead, maybe not 52 years, that's an awfully long period of time about which to make predictions. But if we look ahead maybe a decade, say roughly 10 years, what's your biggest hope and what's your biggest fear? So I'd love to hear from each of you about each vis-a-vis the LGBTQ community on both legal rights and on the ground. Steve, I'll come back to you first, if that's okay.
Well, I guess my thinking is not that hopeful in terms of a lot of issues. I say that in part because, again, I'm Jewish, and Jews were slaves 5,000 years ago. In the 1940s, 7 million were killed in the Holocaust. And between those dates, there was consistent action against Jews. It continues today. There are people in Congress who make anti-Semitic comments and then back off them. It continues. And it's something that community, my Jewish community, has put up with from the beginning. And you learn we have to fight. We have to fight every single day, and it will probably not end. I think that's the same thing for our community. Our community is a minority. It doesn't lend itself to complete understanding by everybody in the world. There's a lot of hostility, and I think it's going to take constant and consistent action on the part of our lawyers, on the part of our social workers, on the part of our benefactors, on, to keep the fight going. That's all we can do, is keep it going so that we win here, maybe we lose something there, maybe the next day we win something a little bigger. I think I know people, and people are people. It's not going to change that much. So we have to be vigilant. That's it.
Thank you for that and for those reflections. Cary, let me turn to you. Biggest hope here.
Yeah, I mean, hope is a tough ask right now. I don't think it's a great, I don't think it's a great time from the perspective of the work I'm doing. I don't want this panel to end without mentioning that although you've probably seen it in the newspapers, it should be covered a lot more. There is an absolute war on transgender people going on in this country right now. Over 100 bills have been introduced in states throughout the country. Many of them have passed. They're the most extreme bills we've seen. That train is just rolling along. Let me just cite two, in case you are unaware of what's going on. Arkansas just passed the first ban on gender-affirming healthcare for minors. Any kind of gender-affirming healthcare is now illegal in Arkansas for anyone under 18 years old. There was absolutely harrowing testimony from parents, from students, from medical officials throughout the state, talking about the number of suicides, talking about the suffering, talking about the minors who are already halfway through this process, who now are going to be going through extreme physical problems, families needing to move, families that don't have the money to move. I mean, absolutely horrific, so horrific that the Republican governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, vetoed the bill and said, this is just government running way too deeply into people's lives. The legislature overrode him and that bill passed. right? I was just reading the ACLU's brief in the case. The week after that bill passed, Arkansas Children's Hospital reported multiple suicide attempts from transgender youth in response to the bill. And that was just in 1 week. I think it could be a very scary situation down there, and that's model legislation for a lot of folks in other states. I'm just going to mention one other bill. Arkansas also passed a sports ban. Idaho passed a sports ban. Idaho completely banned any girls or women, trans girls or women, from playing girls' sports. And they allow, under this law, anyone to challenge the sex of a girl playing on a sport. If you say, I don't look at that one, I don't think she's a real girl, she then has to submit to a genetic test, a blood test, or a physical examination of her reproductive anatomy by a doctor, and the doctor has to certify that she really is a girl in order for her to keep playing on the girls' team. Right? Forget transgender. Every single girl in Idaho is now subject to sex verification under this law. A district court has enjoined it. It's at the 9th Circuit. I'm actually, okay, a little hope. I am actually hopeful that that horror will not stand, because it's,
right.
Okay. But that, you know, I'm not sure that's really hopeful that that's where my hope is coming in, that horror will get struck down. So I just want to say, my fear is this. My fear is that we made some progress, and that maybe the most privileged members of the community will retain some rights, although see my previous discussion of Fulton, even that's going to get chipped away. But maybe same-sex marriage is here to stay. And oh, my gosh, I'm not looking down my nose at that. That's a very important thing. But so one of my fears is that will be it, and that this effort to hive off transgender people and every less privileged member of this community will succeed. I guess let me try to say a hope that this somewhat that has gotten so extreme, these political tactics, that it will galvanize some people, that the intersectionality of all this, by the way, who do you think is being challenged? Whose sex is being challenged? It's almost entirely Black girls, cis girls and trans girls. It's almost entirely. So the intersections are huge. My hope for the future is that communities can come together and realize this is all of us. This is racial minorities, this is women, this is LGBTQ, this is so many different communities affected by all of this. So the best thing in 50 years will be that more people start to understand that, and we can fight back more effectively.
Disheartening, but thank you. Eloquent and powerful, if disheartening, right? Kara, how about you?
You know, I'm a big fan of both and thinking. So yes to everything Cary just said. This is a terrifying time for our transgender and non-binary community. 100 bills have ravaged our states, and they are just as scary as she says. And so I don't want to minimize this very real wave of anti-trans legislation, or to minimize the harm that this legislation, even existing, whether it passes or not, has on the real lives of transgender and non-binary people. And I want to talk about the hope. I have the privilege of running 2 different youth centers, and we have a youth empowerment program for the different age cohorts. And my favorite age cohort to talk about are middle school youth. They are 10 to 13 years old. They are out to their families. They are out in school. They are connected enough to navigate their way to an LGBT center and to get into a leadership development program. These youth are so inspiring. They are powerful. They don't even see the limitations that I saw for myself as a young person, you know, just 30 years ago. And so, you know, I really think there is a revolution on the horizon. These young people who are coming out so young means that they have to continue to live with their families. And yes, there's a group who are going to get rejected, and that's a huge problem, and we talked about that. 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. But for the rest, who find a way to navigate their home with their families, they are changing hearts and minds. The fastest growing group of supporters for our center in San Diego are the straight parents of amazing LGBTQ youth. And so if we can redefine, going back to politics, if LGBT people are 10% of the population, how are we ever going to win anything? Well, we've gotten there with the support of our friends, families, our neighbors, our communities. And so I have seen just in the last 5 years, an incredible revolution in our community here in San Diego, where it's the bravery and the authenticity of transgender and non-binary young people who are 10, 13 years old, explaining their existence so simply, so beautifully, that it has changed the hearts and minds of their family members, so much so that their family wants to get involved in LGBTQ equality and sees a role for themselves as the mama bears and the papa bears who want to protect and defend and build a stronger movement. Those people who themselves are not LGBTQ can talk to others who are not LGBTQ about what it means. And I truly have not found a more powerful messenger for our movement than the parents of transgender and non-binary youth, except for the youth themselves. So that gives me a lot of hope. We have so much legislation to combat, and for certain regions to pass anti-trans sports laws when they have never once had a transgender young person try out for a team, that just exposes what this is, right? It's a plot from people who don't support our community to chip away. And so I do have some of the fears that Cary has, but I also have deep hope. This next generation has built on what our Stonewall generation paved for us, on what the generation after paved for us, on what my generation is continuing to build. And I think they're going to make a much stronger movement for us all.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us some sense of the possible in the midst of the very, very real and severe and concerning challenges that it's also very important to talk about. I want to take one of our questions from an audience member now, which is for elected officials who care about these issues and who want to try to help, what can they do? I mean, obviously, opposing these bills is one place to start, but beyond that, is there other low-hanging fruit that people can either be lobbying elected officials about, or that sympathetic elected officials can focus on? That's a question from one of our members of our audience today. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Kara, I might come back to you for that. If you had an elected official in your office saying, "What can I do? I'm just one person, but I want to help. Where should I start?" Where would you do it? What would you direct them to?
I'd start by saying I don't just want to talk to the LGBT elected official. Right? We need LGBT elected officials to be champions for our community, and we also need non-LGBT elected officials to be champions for our community. So I'm going to lift up a real story of something that happened here in San Diego in the last 2 months. We had an electoral revolution. Our board of supervisors has been run predominantly by Republicans who did not support LGBT equality for 100 years. And this last November, we had an election where all of a sudden it changed. And we have 3 progressive, very supportive of LGBTQ folks who are on the board of supervisors. One of those elected officials, her name is Norah Vargas. She is the first immigrant and the first Latina to be on the San Diego board of supervisors. She is not LGBT, but she was a leader in the South Bay, and she helped me open up the first youth center for LGBT youth in Chula Vista. And so she was a part of that before she ran for office. Then she runs for office. This is the first budget cycle, and we got $5 million specifically for LGBTQ housing in San Diego. That is an incredible victory. It is truly beyond what I could have even dreamed of 5 years ago. And it's real. And that's an elected official. She just called me and said, "How much do we ask for it?" I didn't have to lobby her. There was no meeting. She was already with us. And so I think we really need to hold all of our elected officials accountable. Our community gets outreach to a lot because support from our community is meaningful, and we need to hold both LGBTQ elected officials and non-LGBT LGBTQ elected officials to make real policies and real decisions that make a difference in the real lives of LGBTQ people. So $5 million for LGBT specific housing, that's pretty incredible. And that was not from someone who's LGBT.
Thank you. Steve or Cary, anything to add?
You know, from my point of view, the only thing that we can do is, excuse me, try and elect people who will do the right thing. Unfortunately, I believe that a lot of our politicians are in politics for their own reasons. And those reasons are not always, I want to serve a term in Congress or two or something like that and do the right thing. It's more about, I want to get in and stay in, and what can I do to stay in? I think we need to focus on finding people who will do the right thing. And maybe they'll lose the next election, but when they lose, they say, okay, I lost. I can go back to the real world. And I know I lost in part because I did something good. And at the same time, I do want to point out, because there is so much terrible stuff that is happening with this community, with our community. At the same time, I don't know how many people know that in New York, they appointed a gay man to what we would call the Supreme Court. In New York, it's not called the Supreme Court. Somebody was appointed to that court who's openly gay. I never saw anything in the newspapers about it. The Supreme Court, we have an openly gay Supreme Court justice in the California Supreme Court. There was nothing really in the papers about it. So while we have, that's what I was trying to say before, while we have all of the problems that are still so significant, it would be a shame if we closed our eyes and our minds to all that we've achieved in a short period of time. That's it.
Well, I think you've given us the perfect note on which to end, which is, I mean, to both recognize how much has changed, and many of it in very positive directions that have created real opportunities and significant moves toward equality, but that there's also enormous portions of the LGBT community who aren't benefiting from those changes, as well as legal clouds on the horizon that could roll back some of what's already even happened. Thank you to all three of you for a really important conversation. I'm proud of that all of you have lived in UCLA, and of course I'm tremendously proud of the Williams Institute and all of the work that the Williams Institute has done, an important piece of this move toward equality. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to our audience for being with us today. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.